thank you for joining me for this exciting Women's History Month conversation with Judge Nancy Gertner. Judge Gertner is a former U.S. federal judge who built her career around standing up for women's rights, civil liberties, and justice for all. She has written and spoken widely on various legal issues and has appeared as a keynote speaker, panelist, or lecturer concerning civil rights, civil liberties, employment, criminal justice, and procedural issues throughout the United States, Europe, and Asia. She has received numerous awards, including the Thurgood Marshall Award from the American Bar Association, which recognized her contributions to advancing human rights and civil liberties. The Marshall Award has been given to one other woman, the late Justice Ruth Ginsburg. Judge Gertner is retired from the federal bench and is now on the faculty of the Harvard Law School and continues to teach and write about women's issues around the world. I'm thrilled to have Nancy here today to talk about the state of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how we can learn from the past to take courageous action towards more equitable and inclusive institutions. Nancy, thank you for joining me today.
I'm delighted.
Thank you. So my first question, how are you doing? And is there anything that you're excited, that anything you're working on that's exciting to you right now?
I'm doing great. I've been privileged to have 3 careers. This was someone just introduced to me this way, and it's true. 3 careers. So one was as a civil rights and criminal defense lawyer, and one was as a judge. And the third, it's a fancy way of describing it, is sort of a public intellectual, because I write and speak. I'm occasionally on CNN. If they have makeup, I'm on. I don't just go on. I have to, I'm at an age where there has to be some preparation to going on. And I am, whereas when you're a lawyer, you can only represent the people that you have chosen to represent. When you're a judge, you can only do the case in front of you. Now I can write about anything. I have an ongoing relationship with the Boston Globe, occasional op-eds in the New York Times and the Washington Post, and it's and I'm working on a book.
Okay.
I'm working on a book about the men I sentenced, whom I am meeting. Not all of them, but many of them. The ones I'm meeting are the ones whose case broke my heart, where I had to impose a sentence because the law required it, with which sentences which I thought were unjust, unfair, and disproportionate. So that's been my project for the past several years, and it's difficult, but I want to talk about it.
Wow. And how have how have you been received by the men that you've met with so far?
It's remarkable. This all began with a Facebook message. A man writes to me and says, "Hi, this is Daryl Green. I'm now an iron worker. I have a family. I've written a book. You probably don't remember me, but I think of you often." I wrote back. I knew exactly who he was. Yeah. He was a man who had been accused of a murder in my court and was facing the death penalty if he had been convicted. He was acquitted in my court, and he was prosecuted in state court and acquitted there. So I knew exactly who he was. We met, we talked for hours, and that meeting led to others. No one has turned me down yet, in part because, it's very gratifying because they knew how hard I tried to make their sentences proportionate, to try to see who they were as human beings and sentence accordingly. So no, everyone has, people are calling me who I had no plans to speak to, but it has been really interesting.
Right. So, one of the things that we are doing this year is talking about courage and how people can be courageous, particularly in the current moment that we're in when it comes to issues of equity and diversity, equity, and inclusion in general. And so your conversations with people that you sentenced makes me think of courage and having the courage to be able to engage in those conversations, because you don't know how those men are going to respond. So what has given you the ability to have that fortitude, that courage, to have those conversations, and how can people think about, having the courage to have difficult conversations?
Well, I mean, here's a personal answer and an institutional answer. The personal answer is one of the advantages of being in stage 3 of your career and your life is that, it's, as we like to describe it colloquially, it's the WTF part of my life. Where what are the consequences? I won't get a judgeship. Well, been there, done that. What are there are no consequences. So it's easy for me to do this. The only consequence to me is a personal one, which is it is a heartrending conversation to have with people who tell you about the impact of what your judicial decisions were and tell you facts about their life that you had never heard of before. And then I'm using both to be accountable, for me to be accountable, but also to talk about how completely screwed up the system was. So in one sense, it's easy for me to do that. I suppose I could go golfing at this point, but I'm a workaholic from top to bottom. And, but this, it seems to me that I have a unique perspective. And that's where it was the unique perspective exactly from having been a criminal defense lawyer and civil rights lawyer that enabled me to see things in court that some other judges may not have been able to see, but also to see things now that are troubling.
And what are some of your new learnings and things that you're seeing that are troubling, both when it comes to the criminal justice system, but also when thinking about women's rights? Are there things that you see that have been positive and good, both, again, criminal justice system and women's rights, and ways that, people behave to help make things better, and then what things still remain troubling?
Well, let me start with women's rights. I began my career with a case called Moe versus Hanley, which was a case that established the right to choose abortion under the Massachusetts Constitution. Mm-hmm. We won that case in 1980, and because of that case, the Supreme Court can pound sand. And in other words, it doesn't make a particle of difference. So what I'm watching now is a very, very troubling rolling back, dramatic rolling back of the kinds of things that we fought for. And abortion is the classic one. I don't think that we can scream enough about this. In other words, that I will use every outlet that I can to talk about this, to scream about it, to demonstrate about it, because it's clear even more now than it was when I was in law school. When I was in law school, there were anti-abortion statutes, and but this is a movement. This is a movement that's not just unraveling the right to choose, but is really, I'm convinced, unraveling women's rights. And so it goes from abortion to in vitro fertilization. And if the young women who listen to this don't realize it, they're coming for birth control next. Mm-hmm. And it seems clear. And one of the things that was clear to me when I was a lawyer and clear to me when I was growing up is that if a woman doesn't have control over her reproductive capacity, it doesn't matter if there's equal pay for equal work. You will never get in the door. And then the relationship between the assault on DEI, which is not just there are instances in which it may have gone too far. We may have been, pressing for a kind of sophisticated understanding of diversity that is not easy to press for. It may have gone too far, but the notion that it is wrong as a matter of law is outrageous to me. Because the other thing that was clear to me in my career, it was one thing to say, okay, women can be in law school. That's great. But that degree would have been worthless if I could not find a job. Right. that degree would have been worthless if when I found a job, the employer would say, as many said to me, women can't be trial lawyers. Why don't you just write the briefs in the back room? In other words, we understood that opening the doors to opportunity was only the first step. You had to make women comfortable in that setting as well, women and people of color. So the unraveling of DEI is, again, we can't fight that hard enough.
So what are ways that we should think about fighting what's happening? Right? I mean, you have had many fights through your careers. You've seen change positively. Like, what are the things that people did that worked? What should we be doing today to make sure that this unraveling, is stopped?
Well, I think people have to make their voice heard. So there's a range of ways of making their voice heard. I mean, obviously, voting is one way. Mm-hmm. Demonstrating is another way. Letters to the editor, letters to your representative. I mean, the worst thing is for us to remain silent in the face of really an assault. Let me go back to the abortion issue for just a moment. It was also clear to me from the very beginning, so even when Roe v. Wade was decided, that it wasn't just a question of abortion and birth control, that this really was about equality. Mm-hmm. And the breadth of the anti-choice movement includes people who care deeply about life, but also plainly include people who simply want to stop women from being equal players in the workplace. And we have to fight that everywhere. Yes. As well. But I think you have to use your voice. That's all we have. Mm-hmm. And make sure your voice is heard. And in one sense, social media enables more voices than certainly we had when I was growing up. And everyone should take advantage of that. Right.
Are there other strategies we should think of in addition to people speaking out and writing letters and, even getting out on the streets, which, we've seen episodically over the past few years, but not with consistency? Are there other strategies you think that would be effective?
Well, although when people got out in the streets over the George Floyd murder, it attracted the attention of the country, and it led to some change, sort of not all the changes we wanted, but it certainly led to some change. I think people should run for office. I think people should, run for school board. But again, it has to be fought. The problem is that there's the creation of a narrative now on the right, which has to be fought at every turn. Yes. And it has to be fought if it's at your school board meeting, if it's at your, select person meeting, even if, although this is harder at the dinner table, it has to be fought because this is really, I think, the unraveling of whatever progress we have made, both on the issue of women's rights and also criminal justice. There's an incredible irony to what's going on today. Crime has actually declined rather precipitously in most major cities, but the local news channel continues to tout whatever crime there is as if it's about to hit all of us. Right. And politicians respond not to the data, not to the facts, but to the news stations. And that has to be challenged as well. You just have to keep on not shutting up. My husband says that now that I can speak, since I've left the bench, I can't shut up. Some truth.
Yeah, I mean, you talked a little bit about parallels. Are there other parallels that you're seeing in the moment that we're in now versus other efforts towards broader civil rights previously?
Well, I mean, certainly with respect to reproductive rights, there was a silent group, and then there were some zealots who were pushing back on the right to choose. The breadth of the anti-choice movement today is troubling. It's more than just some zealots. Significantly, it's the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has let loose forces in mostly the southern states, which are incredibly troubling. And as I say, go beyond those people who have genuine concerns about when human life begins. So, I mean, I think it feels different in the sense that it's a mobilization. There's a mobilization on the right, not just the this or that, episodic statement, this or that politician. There's a mobilization, which is I haven't seen in my lifetime, not to this degree. And again, it extends to reproductive rights, it extends to DEI, and it extends to criminal justice reform as well, enabled by social media in a way that we never had before.
Right, right. And it makes me wonder, how do we counter those narratives? Because those of us that think differently also have access to those tools. And so how do we harness our message, our counter message to why these things are actually good things for society as opposed to negative?
Well, I think we have to tell the stories.
Yeah.
We have to tell the stories. It can't be an abstraction. When DEI is talked about abstractly, you lose. When you talk about, the kid in my law school class who got into Harvard Law School is Black from a not so great college. It's great that he's at Harvard Law School. He comes in and he has no idea what the path to success in Harvard Law School is. A kid whose father was a lawyer or mother was a lawyer comes in and on the first day is looking for a recommendation from me for a clerkship. And the first kid doesn't have a clue where to begin, doesn't organize the world that way. Right. So it was sort of an object lesson of what you needed to do affirmatively. Mm-hmm. We talk about what you needed to do affirmatively in order to make sure that opening the doors was not going to lead to failure. Opening the doors to everyone was not going to lead to massive frustration. So tell the story of that kid. Right. Or one of the men I'm writing about was caught in the crossfire of a shooting when he was 16 and had a bullet in his brain that couldn't be removed. He dealt drugs on the corner, but what else? He had no idea what else he could do in his life. When the lawyers presented the case to me, no one talked about trauma. Right. And I was certain that if this was a middle-class kid, that would be all that we were talking about. Mm-hmm. That would be all that we would be talking about. So you have to tell these stories because the social media, on the one hand, flattens things. Yeah. And you need to fill in the details and name it. And I mean, name it in our stories to one another, name it in the books we write or in the speeches we give. And then I said, you have to take over the wheel, the levers of power here, right. because those levers are basically promoting one voice and not all of ours.
Right. And that was a very concerted campaign to take over judgeships in, at various levels, so that they would have that control. And you're seeing it now with school committees, right? They're trying to get in now at the local level to take those over. And you're right, it's important that people are mindful and run for office and are intentional about, how we think about who's going to be in what position.
Right.
And play a long game.
Even the attacks on Harvard, right? I mean, it was unimaginable that even an elite institution would get the kind of pressure that they're getting. And it's critical that people have to it happens when there is social change. At the beginning, you talk about why and how and flesh it out. And then as it gets baked into people's practices, you stop explaining why it was important. And that's my point about narrative. Right. There was a reason why we turned to DEI, and it had to do with the fact that equal opportunity, taking down the signs that said no Blacks need apply or no women need apply, was never enough. Was never enough. The analogy that I like to draw is that if after the Civil War, when the slaves were emancipated, if everyone had said, okay, you're free, goodbye. And it was clear that just opening the doors and taking off the shackles did not begin to address what decades of deprivation had done.
Right.
So, I mean, and that's what we have to talk about. No one is getting, special privileges. We are basically trying to make it possible that opportunity is meaningful.
Right. Right. That's a very good point. And so one of the things that you've talked about a few times and mentioned was the importance of telling the story. And so organizations need to tell the story for why diversity, equity, inclusion is important to them, right? To remind their employees why they should think about this and how it's going to benefit everyone. Given what's happened, the decision the Supreme Court made last summer, it focused just on, higher education institutions, but other organizations now are feeling afraid.
Right.
So what suggestions do you have for them in addition to telling the story? How can they be courageous to move forward, even though, there are other challenges happening in other sectors, but it doesn't necessarily mean they can't continue to do the work. So how do people have the courage to move forward?
I think that there just legally the Supreme Court didn't shut the door to efforts to affirmatively assist marginalized people. It didn't shut the door. It said, you can't use race explicitly in the way that Harvard supposedly used race. But what you're seeing is an enormous amount of creativity, which is using economic class, using scores from high schools. There are other ways to tally up talent,
Right.
to identify talent than just just through ordinary scores, and through the classic affirmative action. In other words, the outreach is there. This was one way that made it easier when you could at least identify race as part of the issues, but it's not the only way. The commitment to diversify workplaces is a commitment that we all should stand by, and to diversify schools. And that diversity can come about through numbers of different means. In my view, the Supreme Court shut down one, but that doesn't mean that the enterprise has to stop. People should not be afraid of understanding, what a diverse workforce brings to the table, because that's true. So there are lots of ways of accomplishing it.
Right. And many of them, I think also, as I understood it, sometimes organizations were setting quotas. Well, we want this number of people, and that you can't do. However, if there are best practices, which often benefit those that have been most marginalized, then if you're applying those practices to everyone, you're going to help the groups who really need the support.
Right. I mean, the notion of sort of looking at economic disadvantage. Economic disadvantage maps onto racial disadvantage in precisely because of the decades of redlining and decades of discrimination. So economic disadvantage can accomplish the same kind of diversity, and there are lots of ways of doing that. I always loved when colleges began to look at, grades in inner city schools. The top of the class, at Dorchester High, deserves a chance for having been top of the class at Dorchester High.
Right.
And so there are lots of ways of accomplishing the same goal. The worst thing would be to let the right, suddenly destroy the goals and think and persuade people that these goals are not to be fought for and not to be sought. That would be the worst thing. That gets to what I was saying before, which is there may be instances in which diversity initiatives went too far, but that's not the same thing as saying that they were wrong to begin with. And it's the latter that's the problem.
Right. And this is where, again, people need to start telling the positive stories. And if we are leveraging all of the channels, they'll eventually get out. Right. Because often, as you said earlier, that you hear a lot of the negative stories in the press, in the media. But if we inundate them with the positive, eventually they'll get through.
Right. Or at least we have no choice but to inundate them with the positive because we can't be passive. The
Right.
worst thing, what is it? The worst thing, I think it was Abraham Heschel who said that it's not the difference between good and evil necessarily. It's between good and passive, good and indifferent,
Right.
good and indifferent. And we can't be indifferent.
Right. And I think for some people, it's not, maybe it's being indifferent. It's also having that courage to do what they know is the right thing to do. And sometimes that's hard because there are certainly risks, and depending on what chapter you are in, there may be more risk than not. But the flip side is if you're not willing to take that risk, which is, I guess, which risk is worse, knowing that things are getting rolled back, or perhaps there may be a consequence for speaking out with friends or family or acquaintances, and not always.
I don't think we have a choice.
Yeah.
I don't think we have a choice because I think that the world we will leave for our children if we don't speak out is so much worse than anything we could have imagined. So I think we have to speak out. And there are lots of ways of doing that. I mean, I was just sort of privileged to have this really crazy career where I began my first high profile case was representing a woman who was accused of killing a police officer. She was a supposedly in the Weather Woman, a sort of radical group against the war that was robbing banks for the purpose of the anti-war movement. She was 25 and I was 29 when I represented her.
Wow.
And I, essentially I won the case. The jury hung and she was given a much lower sentence. And so I was emboldened after that to do what I thought was right and work at it. And then, stage two, when Senator Kennedy wanted me to apply for a judgeship, when everything in my career suggested that was going to be incredibly hard. I love to tell the story of giving a talk once at Yale after I was on the bench, and Judge Sotomayor was on the panel, and I was on the panel. She was not yet a Supreme Court justice. And the women in the audience said to her, "How does one become a judge? Describe your trajectory." And she says, "Well, you go to this fine law school, you do well, you go out and you work for the government, you have opinions, but you're cautious about how you express them, and you become a judge." Then it was my turn. I said, "You go to this fine law school, clerk for a judge, and then you represent the first lesbian feminist radical revolutionary you can find accused of killing a police officer. You do every abortion case in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. At one point, you give a speech on Boston Common and burn your bar card. And then for the final coup de grace, you marry the legal director of the ACLU and you become a judge." So there are lots of routes.
Right. Right. So before we end, I want to just allow you, if there's any words of encouragement or specific things you want to have people think about and or do to help prevent our rights from continuing to be rolled back, to be able to take back the narrative. What would be the words of encouragement or the things you would tell people to do?
You have to think about all the moments in your life when you interact with others. And you have to think about how you can use those moments to make sure you describe the kind of narrative we're talking about. How do you use those moments with your children? How do you use those moments at the school board meeting? How do you use those moments, maybe not at Thanksgiving if you want to make sure that there's peace and quiet, but how do you use those moments in all the aspects of your life? Because it starts small and then things build. But as I said, silence and indifference is not possible these days.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we will wind up for our children with a very different world than the world we envisioned.
Yeah. Well, Judge Gertner, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to speak with you and to hear your words of encouragement, the insights that you have. So thank you on behalf of YW and everyone that is part of our community.
Thank you so much. This was great fun.